Okay, Dr. Josef, thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here, Reese.
Excellent. Just like we just said in just before we started recording, this story around mental health and and everything that comes along with it is quite fascinating, really. So I'm really eager to get into the meat and potatoes about the current state of humanity, society, where it's going in terms of mental health. I know you're doing some fantastic work now in helping people come off all types of medications, psychiatric medications. There's lots to get into, but just first of all, would you mind just go into a bit of background on, who you are, where you've come from, in your journey, and what you're doing now?
Yeah, yep, certainly. So my name is Josef Witt-Doering. I'm originally from Australia. I'm a medical doctor that went to the US to study psychiatry. Ended up meeting my wife and settling down over here. Board certified psychiatrist, all that. But it's probably something that's maybe a little bit more unique about me is that I went into industry and drug regulation. So after I finished my training, I went to work for Johnson & Johnson in their I guess the pharmaceutical branch, which is called Janssen. They make the most novel psychiatric drugs out of any company, I think in the history of manufacturing. And after that, I went to work at the FDA. And then I did what most people do when they leave drug regulation is they go and get a job back in industry with a fat salary. And I did that very common pathway of going from drug regulation into, helping industry.
Very tempting, right?
So yeah, very tempting. Yeah. And, at that stage I had a young daughter and all of that and a wife. And I was just like, well, I can't, the government salary it isn't all that. I mean, I've talked about this before, so I'll mention it, but to give people like a sense of how tempting it could be, I was making $153,000 working for FDA. That was the salary. When I added up the total compensation package that I got from industry when I left FDA, it was about $700,000 US. Just to give you a sense of the multiple that can happen when you do that. So yeah. Tempting could be an understatement, and so that's, but that's not the end of the story. The story doesn't end with, now I'm making a great salary in a drug company and everything's great, because the story kind of goes on from there into a sort of crisis of consciousness that I had, when I realized that. The research that's happening in drug companies, what's going on with drug regulation, and mostly in my field, in psychiatry, really, I started to believe it wasn't really helping people, and that I couldn't really be a part of that system anymore and feel passion or feel drive about what I was doing. I mean, it started to feel like a lie, and so I left and really doubled down on a practice that I had with my wife, where we take people off psychiatric medications. And I know that may be coming out of the blue, but the other theme that's kind of going on in the background through all of this, when I'm at FDA and in industry, is I'm realizing just how scanty the evidence basis is for the psychiatric medication, how long they're studied for. I'm realizing that the side effects are actually a lot worse than I was ever told and ever was led to realize. And so I'm learning all of these things along the way. And so, it became really apparent to me that there was actually a huge problem where people were having a lot of side effects. They're actually stuck on the meds. They couldn't get off. And they really didn't want that to be their life, dependent on a medication that wasn't helping them. And so I decided to do that. That was the thing that started to inspire me. That was the thing that made me want to get out of bed in the morning and feel excited, because I hadn't been excited in my other job. Although I was well compensated, I would hardly say I was excited or driven to do that. And so right now we probably, I would say there's not a lot of competition, so I'm not kind of tooting my horn too much, but we would be the biggest group, I think, in the world that's doing psychiatric deprescribing now. We have have a team of about 4 people, and we're helping a lot of people come off their meds, and that's my day to day now. That's what I do.
I hear, because from the outside, I'm in the UK, so I get to see sort of, an outside view of what goes on, in the States in terms of the FDA. You hear some shady stuff, man. I'm not going to lie, and it just seems, I don't know, it just seems a bit wild over there at the moment in terms of what's going on and what's being approved, and the decision making that's going on, and all types of shady nonsense that you just wouldn't expect from a regulator. When you joined the FDA, how was it an immediate sort of reaction, like, oh crap, look, there's a lot of stuff going on here that I don't want to be involved in? Or was it something that evolved over time? Was you asked to do anything in particular that which you thought was perhaps not quite right, or did you see what was going on there? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think this is. I'm so glad that you're leading it here, because I think one of the biggest realizations that I had going through all of this was learning about how these institutions that are meant to be protecting the public actually become corrupted. Because I think if you're on the outside, a lot of the time, you know that they're not really working to protect people in the way that they ought to be, because, you see disasters and things like that. And it can be hard to understand how that happens. Maybe you might imagine, are there some shady back channel deals? Are there bribes going on? Are there, is there, bad actors doing things that may seem, almost criminal? But the reality is, in some ways, much simpler and more disturbing. And I say it's more simple because it's really easy for people to understand, especially if they've worked in a corporate environment before, and they understand kind of the economics of things. So with that description, let's talk about what I learned at the FDA, and I'll try and unpack some things. Well, probably the first thing I learned at the FDA was that there was a lot of emphasis on drug approvals. And so we had about 15 people in the division of psychiatry, and most of our time was spent giving the green light to protocols that industry would send to us. Because, when you want to get a drug onto the market, you design a study, you want to recruit patients. But before you can do that, you have to get sign off for the FDA. They have to say, yeah, this is safe. You're not going to be endangering people. And that's part of the research enterprise. Drug companies that have to do that because they need to get their 2 clinical randomized controlled clinical trials to get the drug on the market. That's legislation, really, that they need to do. So there's a huge drive for them to get that done. And so when they send it in, all hands on deck at the FDA, we're going to look at that protocol and get it done. Another big task that we spent a lot of time doing is something called the review of NDAs. And NDA is a new drug application. So when a company has done enough of these clinical trials and they want to get the drug on the market, they send them in a big packet over to the FDA, along with the animal research, maybe some studies on pharmacology showing how, justifying that the dose should be, once a day or twice a day, a big packet of information. And we look at that. And so you're listening to all of this and you're saying, hey, that sounds pretty reasonable. That sounds like, kind of good work that the FDA is doing. I'm glad someone's doing that. But where it gets a little tricky and kind of conflicted is that a long time ago, I think this happened in the 90s, the mid-90s, the industry was getting upset at the FDA. They were like, hey, we need you to review our stuff faster. The patent on our drugs are expiring. Why is this sitting on your desk for several months? Come on, let's get these drugs onto the market, review them. and FDA was underfunded, and essentially they said you could help us with the funding. And so that went through Congress, and this act called the PDUFA Act, I think it's Prescription Drug User Fee Act, stipulated that industry could actually pay FDA. They could give them, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe higher than that, to hire more people to kind of accelerate the rate at which they looked at these drugs. And so industry essentially said, we're going to give you all this money, but here are some timelines. If we send you a protocol, we need you to do it in 30 days. If we send you a new drug application, we need you to look at that in 9 months. No longer.
String attached. You're right.
Yeah. And any longer than that, you're going to be in breach of our contract, and your funding is going to be in jeopardy. Up until now, that maybe that seems okay. Yeah, maybe that's just a compromise. But let me tell you how it affects the way things happen in the FDA now. The FDA kind of marches to that. They're solely focused, they're mostly focused really on doing that. And there's a lot of other things that happen with drugs, that don't have to do with drug discovery and drug development. For instance, post-marketing safety problems are a major one of these things. So, recently there's been the issue of PSSD, which is post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And, this is now, this is when people get on antidepressants, and it's uncommon, but a small proportion of them are developing permanent sexual dysfunction when they come off. This has been acknowledged by the EMA, the second largest drug regulator in the world. They've updated all of the labels for the SSRIs and the SNRIs, things like Effexor and Prozac, Lexapro, Zoloft, all those drugs. It's been acknowledged by Wendy Burns, who I think is a very senior psychiatrist over in the UK. But FDA has kind of been sitting on their hands for it. I mean, a petition went in there about 7 years ago from David Healy, and they haven't really done anything. So what I used to see there was that we would just be doing drug development type stuff, almost in the benefit of kind of helping industry reach their goals. And when these other things would be coming up, these other safety problems, we wouldn't be given the time to really look at them. In fact, there was no system built around it. And so I think that's like one way that I've really seen kind of the agency kind of been tilted towards being more drug friendly, and that they're really acting towards approval, and there's less emphasis on really understanding the safety problems that are turning up.
So it's more than it's more. Well, from what I can gather there, it's just about getting these applications through as quick as possible. Not really. Was there much attention paid to what the actual, I suppose side effects, the actual signs behind it? Was there like emphasis on that, or was it just about getting it through as quickly as we possibly can?
So yeah, so here's the thing: the research into the applications when they come on the market is actually pretty thorough. They're really looking at everything. But the problem is that a lot of these drugs, they're only studied, especially in psychiatry, for 2 to 3 months, right? So you get a really good picture of what's happening at the start, but as you may be aware, most psychiatric medications aren't taken for 2 to 3 months. In fact, the median duration of use is about 2 years. And we're at a point where I think, prior to COVID, 13% of adults were taking antidepressants, and some of the figures I've heard recently are even higher than that. I think I even heard that it was like 20% of adult women in the Western world are now on antidepressants, which is 1 in 5, wow, which is really high. And with a median duration of use of about 2 years there, there's a lot of, these drugs, the things that the drugs really change what they do over time. These are not static entities. They will have an effect within 2 to 3 months when you begin them, but because of a process in the body called homeostasis, which is essentially the body's way of rebalancing itself, the longer you're on a drug, the more kind of changes happen in the body to counteract that. A lot of people think that, serotonin drugs, they're acting on this really unique place in the brain, just affecting our mood in some, little way. But, the serotonin and all of these other neurotransmitters are active throughout the body. They're involved in the way our heart beats, the way our digestion happens, the way our blood vessels constrict. And if you're taking a drug for a long period of time that is disrupting those systems, then you end up, the body sends signals back up to the brain and says, you need to shut this system down. You need to make adjustments. You need to lose receptors. You need to change your sensitivity of the receptors so they can come back to the normal state. And that's going to take time. And so I think that really the understanding of the drug really isn't fully mapped out when it hits the market. But in many ways, I think, FDA isn't really paying attention to what's happening long term with the drugs afterwards. I don't think they're really looking at that closely. And so you come to a situation where, and this is really relevant to what I do, I mean, we've got issues like protracted withdrawal, which is essentially a form of brain damage that happens to people when they come off antidepressants. You have PSSD, and you also have the issue of what I think is treatment-resistant depression or tardive dysphoria. And this is not just me. Other people have been talking about it. Like, what is the effect on your mood if you take a antidepressant drug that modulates your neurochemistry for several years? Is there a possibility that because there's a chemical in there and your brain is changing and your body's adapting in ways that could actually lead to a depressive state over time? And I mean, we've seen this with many, many other drugs. Like, we know drugs like Xanax, they actually make people more anxious over time. And so there's this whole question of like, are these drugs really that effective when taken in the long term? We know the 2 to 3 month trial shows that they have an effect, but like, that's the whole other question that no one's even asking. Like, how useful are these things? After all of these changes and all of these months and years later. That's the question that I don't think people are really looking into. And that's what I found when I started really thinking about this and how little we knew and how much I actually was learning more and more about the side effects. I'm just like, there is no way we should be practicing and using these drugs in the way we're currently doing it. It just seems dangerous and reckless.
Yeah, it's pretty scary really to look at the destruction that these drugs have had over the last, 50 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, and it's been nothing but an upward trend for all those decades. More and more people now are being diagnosed with all types of mental illnesses. And I always question why. Why does something happen? Nothing happens by random. There's always a cause for something. And my question really is, why is this happening? Why are so many people becoming mentally ill and prescribed drugs and, taking them for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe even longer than that? I know people that have taken them for 2 decades minimum, and with no improvement. So, why is this happening, do you reckon, Dr. Josef? What's going on here?
Yeah. It's such a good question. It's a hard one to answer because there's multiple variables, but maybe if I kind of pick at them one by one, you and I guess the listeners to this may be able to kind of piece this mosaic together and kind of get it. So the first one is the way we decided to diagnose mental illness. And so, way back when, let's start at the turn of the century, the early 1900s when Freud was really popular. The idea of anxiety and depression, they used to call it neurosis, was a really prominent way of his ideas were really prominent. And these were sort of unconscious conflicts that you had to, bring to the surface. Family conflicts. There were things like the Oedipus complex, but it really was a way of looking at mental health as more relational in nature and things like that. And there was actually, there was a lot of really weird stuff about Freud. In some ways, some of the ideas were good, but it really got very fixated on internal conflicts and relational stuff. And don't get me wrong, relational stuff is important, but there's a lot more to mental health than that anyway. So we had that model for a long time, and honestly, no one could really agree on who was sick and who wasn't sick. And there was a big crisis of confidence in how we were kind of saying, oh, this depression is due to this conflict versus that one and such. And to cut a long story short, there were a bunch of embarrassing things that happened in psychiatry, and then they landed on the DSM. And that was a new way of conceptualizing mental illness. And so, the DSM redid their diagnostic categories in the 70s, and they made it a list. Essentially, it was like, well, we don't really know why depression happens. Maybe it's biological, maybe it's due to conflicts. And frankly, we don't really care anymore. We're just going to say depression is, 5 out of these 9 symptoms. And at least we're speaking the same language now. And over time, we might get a better sense of which forms are more biological and which forms are more due to intrapsychic conflicts and, things between the id and the ego and whatever. So that's where it was kind of tilted in the 70s, and it's kind of stayed there. Now,
just so I can interrupt quickly there, Dr. Josef, what's interesting that I found when I interviewed Robert Whittaker was that how they landed on those symptoms was not through a thorough scientific method, based on scientific evidence. It was actually a consensus of a group of a consortium of psychiatrists. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding, and I know that sounds it sounds crazy if you look at it from our perspective going back then, but I think at the time it's like there's a researcher out there and they're like, we really need to understand why people are depressed. Okay, we need some kind of criteria to bring people in, and like at least just we got to grab people in some seemingly objective way to start studying them, and then we're going to look at their genes and we're going to look at their histories and we're going to find patterns. And they go, well, all right, doctors in this room, what do you think are the most common symptoms in your depressed patients? And they go, well, they're fatigued and they're tired and they're anxious and they feel really guilt-ridden. And then they go, okay, well, that's what most people are saying. That seems reasonable. And as a starting point, maybe it is reasonable if you're going to start somewhere and then look for biological underpinnings or patterns in that group. But it never really evolved beyond then. And it kind of took on a life of its own, where nowadays people are like, oh, if you have 5 out of 9 symptoms, you've got a medical condition, you have a clinical diagnosis. There's something really unique about that. But that whole diagnostic criteria was meant to give us, was meant to be a starting point where we would be able to say, okay, this is kind of biological. This depression over here looks like it's totally based on life circumstances, poverty, relational problems. We're getting these different patterns, but over time, and I guess I'll talk about the next variable now, over time, we started to get obsessed with biology and the biological understanding of depression. And that's really where pharma comes into it. So in the late 80s, there's a lot of drug development before then, but this is a real turning point. In the late 80s, Prozac, the first SSRI, gets developed by Eli Lilly, and it enters the market. And this is a drug that you take every day for your mood. And a lot of people have questions about that. They go, well, this seems kind of unusual. Take something every day for my mood. Isn't this like, aren't I just, muting my symptoms? Like if I'm upset, if I'm anxious or depressed, shouldn't I be paying attention to that and fixing that? And in response to that, we start getting a lot of language around, well, hey, you actually might have a chemical imbalance. This starts to be a vested interest in describing anxiety and depression as maybe more of a biological process. Let's make Prozac like insulin that people take for diabetes. Let's make it seem like it's this thing that fixes some known underlying process. And so you start getting a lot of this chemical imbalance type language coming out. And that, I think, is really what has kind of gripped the public for the last 30 years. because we've
And that
seen
was
it.
never proven, right? The chemical imbalance theory was literally that. It was just a theory. And
Yep. Totally. It was just a theory, just like you said. People noticed that, hey, you know, we had this really lethargic and depressed person, and we gave them a drug which we know modulates neurochemistry, and they appeared to be more energized. And then so instead of saying, oh, these drugs have energizing effects, or these drugs have anxiety reducing effects, one other way to spin it was, or maybe their brain was broken and now we've rebalanced them. And so that's where this whole chemical imbalance thing is coming from. It's just like a Just So story, almost to help people rationalize taking the medications. And I want to bring it back to the start, Reese, because you said, why is it these days that like so many people are taking these meds? And that idea from Prozac and all of the other drugs that jumped on the bandwagon has, you know, there's been, I guess, a war chest of marketing money in, you know, educating doctors and making ads in the US and, getting engaged with different academic centers around the world to have their professors do this research. It's had such a huge impact in shaping how we talk about depression and these drugs. And so I think kind of marketing and spin from some of these really powerful companies has shaped that. And that's why I think these days it feels really normal to say, oh, well, depression, go and talk to your doctor about it. But it's like, why? Why is that the knee-jerk reaction? Like, what does your doctor know about the things that are making you depressed? Your doctor that you see in a 15-minute visit, is he going to be able to talk to you about why you're not satisfied at work? Why, you've got some maladaptive traits that make it hard for you to connect with an intimate other person or your friends? Is your doctor going to be able to do anything about the poverty that you're in? People take that for granted. I'm going to talk to my doctor because I'm depressed. What are they going to do about it? I mean, the things that actually make people unhappy in the most place, they're not things that doctors are trained to do. I mean, the doctor is trained essentially to write a script for something, but not, I guess, help people in the way that, honestly, I've come to see as the correct way. And actually, it's the most intuitive way for people to think about fixing people with anxiety and depression, the majority of them. But then I think they get taught out of it because everyone gets told, oh, wait, no, it's a serious medical condition. They got to see the doctor for it. And I mean, that's really the idea that a lot of people have these days. And I think it's very harmful.
Yeah, it's the whole rebranding it as a medical illness, right? And now we've got people, as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, toddlers, believing they have a medical condition and there's something wrong with them. That they're depressed. Because I remember my bloody depression at 5 years old. And they're taking hardcore psychiatric drugs at 6 years old. And they go on to, because it doesn't just lead to just taking one tablet, it develops. This is what I've noticed. It's almost like a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a conveyor belt. They start taking one and they hit a certain age and they get a review or whatever. And the doctor says, oh, well, actually, you've got this symptom and so you take this drug. And before you know it, they've got these collection of different drugs that they're taking. And by the time they hit their teenage years, it's a right mess. It's a right mess. And what you're doing now is so vital. And it just seems that you're part of the minority of people that have come to, they've seen the light almost, or whatever you want to call it. And now you're doing great work to get them off these meds.
I was going to touch on that point and just say, I think about the parents that put their kids on the meds, and these are parents that love their kids and who have been led astray by the doctors, right? The truth is that the medical education has failed doctors. Most doctors are good people, but there are some really, I think the academic leaders in a lot of the medical specialties have been highly compromised by their relationship with the pharmaceutical companies. And so I think the academic leaders end up having very pro-drug perspectives on things. They minimize the harms, they amplify the risks because they're engaged and they have a lot of relationships with the drug companies and such. And then it trickles through, it compromises good doctors who are caring people. And then it compromises loving parents who are scared about what's happening with their kids. And because they're not going to go and look at the medical research, how can they? You know, they're going to trust the person in the white coat that's been with them for decades sometimes and just say, hey, I'm going to do it. So, I mean, there's just this, it's just a total, I mean, like I said, sometimes it's really, how could this thing happen? But the most relatable way to explain it to everyone is, when you have a lot of money that's behind certain ideas and an agenda to sell medications, you can just see how things flow down and influence, and it's really not that hard to understand how things happen when you get that part of it. The other thing I wanted to, you're prompting me to think about all these interesting things, like the kid that takes the med. There's a huge opportunity cost to taking psychiatric medications in some instances. I mean, if you're having problems and you take a med as like a young kid, and if that's not a part of a comprehensive plan where someone's helping you identify why you needed the med in the first place and helping you with that, that doesn't happen to a lot of people. A lot of times, you probably have a biological problem, or maybe it runs in your family. They get the med, they go back to their life. What an opportunity cost to take something that mutes your emotions and may not work long term, and you never get the ability to feel maybe things that you should be feeling because they're sending you signals that things aren't going well. And if you're feeling that, you may be more likely to act on them. And I worry about people who stay in abusive situations or bad jobs and things like that, because when that signals are going off telling them, be anxious, be depressed, they get shut down. And that's another thing I don't think people talk about, is how I actually think they can be detrimental to someone's development and emotional maturity by turning that off.
They're going through puberty. Their hormones are changing, and you've got these foreign agents in the body that are disrupting that process. Of course, it's going to have an effect. You don't have to be a genius to work that one out, really, do you?
Yeah. Well, that's not what the people hear. Yeah, I feel like the people hear from the doctor, it's well tolerated, minor side effects.
Yeah, of course, you're going to believe the doctor.
They get that. But I think what you said, Reese, is actually the most intuitive way. I think that's how naturally people would view this, coming into it with their own senses before they get almost, I think, taught to think in a different way.
Mm. Yeah, it's quite a sad one, really, because we've built a culture around it as well. I've noticed. You see, whenever I don't know if you've noticed this, Dr. Josef, but if I go onto Instagram, which I don't do very often, I've noticed now that there's lots of, there's an online culture around mental illness and mental things like depression and ADHD. This all sort of pops up on my timeline, and it's quite interesting to see, because it's all dressed up in quite a fancy way. The pictures look really sort of, I don't know, engaging almost, and the language is quite interesting as well. And it will say something like 5 symptoms of ADHD or something, or how to know if you're ADHD. And I scroll through it just to have a look. And I'm like, you've just described me. So does that mean then that I'm ADHD? And obviously I know I'm not. But the symptoms are so generalized And, it's almost you're describing pretty much everybody. Everybody at some point is going to feel that symptom. And I think I'll give you an example. One of the symptoms was an ADHD person doesn't like doing what they don't like to do. And I thought, well, that's everybody. That's everybody, right? So, and there was a few more which were very similar. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that was the one that's really stood out to me. I'm thinking, how many other thousands of people have read that post and are now thinking, oh, wait a second, I'm now ADHD, or I could be ADHD. Maybe it's a 14-year-old girl or lad or something, and then they go to school and they start getting a little bit of trouble, and it's like, oh, wait a second, I read that symptom, I've got that symptom, and the teachers, called it out. And before you know it, now they're talking to their mother, maybe they've got in trouble in school again, and now their parents bit, and this all leads on to maybe at some point they get diagnosed. Have you noticed that at all? This sort of online culture?
Yeah, the online culture, there's a lot of things there that are troubling. I mean, there's the self-diagnosis, and I think in general, what people hear in society these days about mental illness is people with mental illness, they're bullied, they're stigmatized, they're victims, and it's under-recognized, and we all ought to be really kind to these folks, and they have these, they have brain problems, and it's kind of like a message like that. And I'm going off script here, but I also feel like you can. I think sometimes there's almost benefits in a sense to self-identifying as being mentally ill. Sometimes, there could be really legitimate, scary things happening in your life. There's some abuse going on at home. You're not safe. You're getting beat up, and then there's maybe you're not doing well at school, and you're just like, man, I'm a kid. I don't really understand how all of these things are influencing me. All I know is that I'm not doing as well as my peers, and I feel really shit about myself. And, what you would like is a professional to kind of sit down with that person and just say, hey, let's really unpack this. But I think sometimes they walk into the doctor's office and they say, well, I must be depressed. And the doctor goes, well, that's, meet 5 out of 9 symptoms. It's a lot easier for me to just kind of write you a script and do that than really get to know you. And so they go, okay, well, that's the thing. That's why I feel so miserable. It's not because, I got a history of trauma. I have a hard time relating to people now because of a very negative perception of the world and other people's motives. They're not getting some kind of more empowering understanding of what's happening. And so, maybe it's because maybe it's because I have a mental illness. It's the same with ADHD. Not everyone needs to go and be a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. Like, if you don't like some of these, you don't like writing essays, you don't like, high-level mathematics. Truth is, you may be way better as a salesperson. You may be way better with your hands. And so there's all these messed up things, ideas that people have about what it means to be successful. And so, follow that line, oh, I don't like these things. Now I have a brain problem. I'm going to get on stimulants so I can study subjects I'm naturally not interested in, so I can get a job I'm not actually passionate about, and so I can be unhappy, rather than someone saying, well, what naturally makes you tick? I feel like schooling systems, all of these things, sometimes at their worst, they can feel like a production line where it's just like, let's just kind of churn people through. There's not this individual level of attention. And I know we're jumping all over the place, and I hate to bring it here, but I will, because it is something I'm worried about. I also worry about the transgender stuff as well, as that being a trendy topic, and how you can have people who are confused about their sexuality, maybe they're unhappy. And when you've got social media just saying, there's this victimized group out there and it's under-recognized, and really celebrating it, I also think it can lead to people saying, well, maybe that's what's going on, and then all of a sudden they end up on treatments for something that may not actually be the true root cause of what's going on. I mean, hey, if it is for some people, that's okay, but I do certainly worry that sometimes we just cheerlead people onto hormone blockers and things like that because we want to be championing a social cause rather than really actually caring about the person that's there. I think people get that confused. It's a really interesting interface between medicine, social topics, politics, and how I think it makes, how it influences young people.
Yeah, well, young people are susceptible to ideas, right? Especially when you're, well, from a toddler, their formative years, their mind is a sponge, it's wide open, they're not fully conscious yet. And what goes into the unconscious mind, it plays out later on in life. And we're seeing that now. It's funny you mentioned, the transgender stuff, because, that stuff now, it's not very active over here in the UK. We won't go into too much detail on this because it's way off topic, we know, but, in America, in the States, you guys are about 15 years ahead of us in terms of that. You've been teaching this to kids for for 15 years. And now we're seeing these kids now as young adults, they're 19, 20 years old. And we're seeing this behavior play out because it's been planted in their unconscious from the age of, since kindergarten, right? They're going around playing with all sorts of ideas back then. So we're seeing that development and we're seeing it play out. And this is what we've got now. These ideas are destructive, and they're confusing so many people. So many people now are confused about who they are and their identity. And, I always go back to the question, why is this happening? I don't suppose you have an answer at all to that question. Have you ever thought about it?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm with all of, with the mental health thing, it's always, the message, the influence always comes from somewhere. If we're talking about the ideas that mental health problems are mostly biological, which isn't, they're minimally biological, and they're mostly, other problems like that one, you can clearly link back to commerce. You can link that one back to drug companies. You can also, in some sense, link it back to the fact that it's a lot easier for psychiatric and medical professionals to function within a biological model because it takes less time than getting to know people. There's real commercial reasons for that kind of messaging to flourish. I think the transgender stuff also comes maybe somewhat from a political sense as well, where you've got certain political groups who, have a reputation for championing the vulnerable and things like that, and that's kind of fanned up. And so yeah, I think sometimes it's who's got the loudest microphone. Is it a political party that wants to talk about something? Is it a drug company that can pay billions of dollars for a message? Ultimately, I'm going to show my cards here and kind of share with people kind of who I am, and maybe it seems naive. I wish the messaging out there was just like, find something that you're passionate about. Doesn't matter what it is, that's important for you. Find an intimate partner you can share your life with, someone that's a real teammate of yours. Have friends, be physically active. If that was the messaging, the main ones, I think people would be on a much better track. When things are, going off base, they're like, probably need one of those 4 core things to feel good again. How can I work towards those things? And instead, I think they get sidetracked into thinking they're the wrong gender sometimes, or that they have some kind of brain problem. And it's just, I would like messaging, but there's nothing to sell with that messaging. That's why we don't hear it, even though I think that is really what people need to hear. That's not selling anything or advancing anyone's agenda. So that's my sense of it.
Well, it's. I'm glad to hear that. I'm. What you've said is absolutely true. And it's not said enough, and it just makes me wonder why that message. Why is the transgender message in a school and not that message? How has that leaked in? How has that crept in? You know, that's what's interesting to me. It makes me think, well, you know, obviously
I brought up the transgender thing because I know it's so off topic, and now we're kind of talking about it, but it's good to juxtapose those things, because I mean, it seems like such a fringe issue, and the other stuff I think is pretty.
Well, it's all linked. It's all linked. It's all causing mental illness. It's all causing mental health problems, because so many kids now that are just so confused about who they are and their identity. Oh my God, I've got a penis, but I feel like a girl. Like, what the hell's going on? I'm 5 years old. You know, obviously that doesn't make any sense. So yeah, it's worrying. It's really worrying. But let's bring it back to, I suppose, you know, what you're doing and the work that you're conducting at the moment. Let's get into that. So what really sparked this whole thing that you're doing now, getting people off psychiatric drugs?
What really sparked it? I mean, there's a huge need, and I mean, maybe on a personal sense, I needed to feel like I was actually doing something truthful. I was really struggling to do work that I didn't really believe in, and then I had this degree and this training, and I had a family and a young daughter, and I'm like, you know, what the hell am I going to do where I don't, you know, where I'm not feeling drained at the end of it? And I go, well, there's, you know, I don't really believe in these drugs, so let's see if we can help people come off of them. And thankfully, there's a huge demand for that. I mean, that there's people. I mean, we have people who live in different states where we don't work, who fly out to Utah to meet with us because they're that desperate to get help coming off, because they've tried everything else. And so, I mean, really passionate about the science of getting people off. I'm really passionate about the impact that we have when we do this. I mean, when we get someone off these meds, I mean, sometimes they lose like 30 pounds. They're no longer anxious about the side effects of the drugs. Sometimes they're more emotionally present with their families and their children. You know, if some of them have been hurt, and we work a lot with people who have been seriously hurt, we get to be there with them while they're recovering. Sometimes that takes a few years and they get better, and then it's really awesome to celebrate with them at the end and just say, this chapter of your life is closed. You're no longer anchored to meds or pharmacies or doctors anymore. You know, go and do what you need to do. And I find it really intellectually stimulating, and I just think it was the only way I could find within my field where I'd be like, I'm actually changing this person's life and in a really helpful way. So it's just been hugely energizing for me. I mean, this is Saturday morning. I do this every Saturday morning. You know, I kind of talk to people and have these conversations, and I just love it. I feel like I've found my purpose, you know, and what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm just so hooked into it now.
Yeah, you strike me as somebody who is quite a passionate person, and you sort of, you know, you very introspective. If I've got that correct, would you say that's correct? Yeah. Somebody who's very self-aware.
My wife would say otherwise, but I think so.
Yeah, no, but it comes across that way. I can see it, which is wonderful. You know, it's a doctor with a conscience is how I would describe it, and that's wonderful to see. You know, and there's a growing number of people, of doctors like yourself, that are finally, you know, they're seeing that what they're actually doing is causing. I'm not doing it on purpose. I get all that, but what they're being told to do is actually causing more harm than good in most cases, I feel. So I'm curious now to get some answers around how somebody would come off medication. Like, obviously this is a very loaded question, but are there some sort of outline steps that you could give that, somebody listening right now, they want to come off the medication, but they don't know what to expect? What could you say to them? What kind of steps would you put in place?
I guess what I would say is it's complicated and can be dangerous. And so I'm going to plug my own channel right now. But if you go to Dr. Josef on YouTube, that's Josef, it's the German spelling. We have a whole playlist called Tapering Tips, where we kind of discuss the best practices we use in getting people off. But in general, I'll do a simple one. If you're just taking one med and you've been on it for years, the way you get off is very slowly. Most of the tapers that I do take between 1 to 2 years to give you a sense of how slow is. You never want to taper in a way where you're going to have severe withdrawal symptoms, because they can be dangerous. And so the idea of coming off, the mindset you need to have is that I'm going to do very small reductions, and I'm just going to let it kind of be like brushing my teeth. I'm not going to think about it too much, and I'm just going to let it take its time, because ultimately that is the safest way for most people to come off if they've been on the drug for years. There's a lot more nuance in there, but in general, that's the idea. What you don't want to do is be on this drug for 2 years plus and then come off over, 2 to 4 weeks or 6 weeks even. That is way too fast after your brain, because your brain has grown around these chemicals. It's like the drug is like a scaffolding. It's part of the structure of your brain. And brains aren't that elastic. They can't just, regrow, within a month or so. They need time. And that's why you need to subject the brain slowly to the absence of the drug over 1 to 2 years, so you give it time to rebuild without destabilizing it too much.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So I've got something that we're going to finish on. I was watching your channel. I noticed that you're doing reaction videos to commercials, which I found really interesting. And it brought to mind a commercial that I'd seen online of a drug from the early 2000s. And I'm wondering, Dr. Josef, would you mind, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. Would you mind reacting to this advertisement for me?
Yeah, no worries. Let's do it.
Okay. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to bring it up.
Think about the week before your period. Do you feel irritability, tension, tiredness? Think it's PMS? Think again. It could be PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Those intense mood and physical symptoms the week before your period. Sound familiar? Call to get free information about PMDD and a treatment your doctor has to relieve its symptoms. Why put up with this another month? It's back. The week before your period. Mood swings, bloating, irritability. Think it's PMS?
Did you take my keys?
Maybe it's PMDD. Those intense mood and physical symptoms right before your period. Sound familiar? To find out how your doctor can help, call or visit pmdd.com today. Why'd feel like this another month?
Well, yeah. So follows a pretty standard playbook. But what I think they do really well is, they empathize with the person, which is what you want to do in sales and marketing. You want to kind of meet them where they're at. You're irritable. You don't want to put up with it. You hate it. I get it, girl. Like, I'm there with you. This sucks. And, I'm listening and I feel your pain. And so, they get the person on side, and then they're just like, well, but let me tell you this. The solution may be that you've got PMDD. It's not PMS. It's actually something your doctor can fix. And so, what they don't know is, Seraphim, like, what is that? Is that Prozac? Is that I have to look that one up.
Yeah, that was rebranded. It was Prozac originally, yeah. And they changed the name of it.
So, they're not saying, we're just going to give you Prozac. If have you heard of Prozac before? If you've got PMS, we're going to give you an antidepressant, and we're going to mask those symptoms, and deal with all of the stuff that goes along with antidepressants. They don't do that. They say, go and talk to your doctor about it. And then the thing is, people go in to see their doctors, and their doctors, they're not, I don't want to paint with the broad brushstroke here, but I will. Like, a lot of them are pretty busy. Maybe a really great doctor would just say, hey, listen, like, this drug's only been studied for a couple of months. You probably don't want to take this long term. I get it. Premenstrual symptoms, they really suck. But in the grand scheme of things, I think you have more to lose by taking this. A lot of doctors, when someone walks in, they go, I think I have PMDD. The doctor goes, oh, it's FDA approved. Okay, we'll write you a script for that. On to the next problem. And that's kind of the transactional nature of medicine at the moment. And I think, with the rush visits and the churn and the doctors wanting to see as many people per hour, there's less of that counseling. And I think the drug companies really get it. So they're always just like, talk to your doctor, because they kind of know that it's going to be really easy for the doctor to write the script. So, it's just bad, man. No.
It really is. It's quite, and the fact that they just rebranded that, and I'm also aware as well that the word seraphim is a play on the word, some Hebrew word, I believe is called. I think it's Seroquel. And Seroquel in ancient Hebrew, you might know this, I don't know. But
that might be the other drug, because Seroquel's that antipsychotic, unless it's also a Hebrew word, I don't know.
Oh, but maybe I'm wrong then, but it's definitely a play on an ancient Hebrew word which is linked to female fertility or something like that. So that was definitely, I can't remember the name of the word now, but yeah, and they dressed it up in like a pretty pink sort of packaging, and made it extremely feminine and just really appealing to the female mind. And it's just interesting how they market it, like you say. Yeah, it's quite fascinating, really, the tactics that are involved in it all.
Yeah. That's kind of the fun stuff about, like, I like looking into this as well. And I'm a small business owner now. Like, I understand some marketing and things like that. And I look at it, I'm just like, wow, this is how this is how they do it. And
yeah,
and they're into it. And so
there's a ton of psychology involved, everything is well thought out, not just, getting the trials sorted out and getting the drug passed. There's all this back end of it, there's all this stuff going on, all these moving parts about how we're going to market this drug to the population. What story are we going to create, where it's relatable, like you said, where it's going to target the audience that we're trying to sell to. There's all these different things to think about. And it's all just sell a drug, to make, and they end up making billions off it, which is, it's questionable, really, very questionable.
I've been reading, I guess, Influence by Robert Cialdini. Maybe this is one that you've come across before, but it's probably one of the best books on modern marketing. I feel like I've learned more from that book about how doctors practice and how drug companies influence doctors than anything else. We usually think that doctors are these objective people, but so much of what we do is, I think, governed by relationships and influence and marketing techniques. Check it out, Influence by Robert Cialdini. It is definitely a book that will, if you look at it from the medical perspective and how doctors are influenced, I think you'll get a lot out of it. Really, really, really cool.
I'll make a note of that one for sure, definitely. You've actually just reminded me of something. I'm conscious of the time, Dr. Josef. How much time do you have left? Are you free for another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, another 10 minutes, yeah.
Fantastic. Have you heard of the book, you probably heard, Brain Energy by Christopher Palmer?
Oh, Chris Palmer, yep.
So I've been just looking into different areas different ways now that people are approaching how to, rectify mental health symptoms. That book there was, very enlightening about how it's a metabolic issue. And, there's a whole sort of arena opening up now called the metabolic psychiatry, I believe is the terminology. And there's a wonderful psychiatrist, Dr. Georgina Edie, you might have seen online, but she's doing fantastic work. Have you looked into this at all, around how there's a huge metabolic issue going on here and how diets can change all of this? And
Yeah, I have actually, and I've been fortunate enough to speak with Dr. Eid and Chris Palmer, both of them, about this topic. Yeah, so, I mean, let me see. There are a few things that I think are legit in psychiatry. I think a couple things. Well, let me put it this way: there's a few things that I think people should really be doing to get their mental health sorted, and one of them is definitely diet, because there's so many. I'll look at this in a few ways. So one, the whole ketogenic side of things, which I know both authors speak about, both psychiatrists, makes a lot of sense to me. Using fat as a fuel for your brain is the more efficient kind of metabolic substrate for the brain to run on. So that makes sense to me. But I think another part that's really interesting is actually the autoimmune component of diets, because I know that there are so many foods which people can be sensitive to, which can cause a wide range of problems, whether it's thyroid problems, gut problems, autoimmune conditions, and they spill over into your mental health. And I know this for me, and I had this experience where I blew my back out doing CrossFit a long time ago, and it was miserable, and I had back pain, and I thought I would live with it for the rest of my life. And then I did one of these diets and it just went away. And this was after spending hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars trying to fix it with physiotherapy. And I just changed my diet and the inflammation went away. And, we know things like celiac disease have psychiatric components. We know, if you're in a state of chronic inflammation, that can lead to some lethargy and feeling out of it. So yeah, clearly I think what we put in our body has the ability to impact our health. In some individuals, I mean, it may be the number one thing causing problems. I don't think we're at the point where we have any tests to really know who is the one person that's going to have that huge benefit. But as an intervention, man, changing your diet is probably one of the best things that you could do. Yeah, maybe you're having some reactions to it and it's going to put you in a better place. But even if you're not having huge reactions to your food, you're going to lose weight, you're going to be in shape, you're going to put good food in your body. I mean, it's just, to me, it's an absolute no-brainer that if you're having any kind of mental health problems, that you should consider, doing things like a clean ketogenic diet. Like if you're having gut problems or autoimmune problems or rashes, and you also have some mental health things, then you must do it, because it's already showing signs that you're in a more inflammatory state, or you're having problems with your gut. And imagine if that was the stone that you turned over and that fixed you, and you didn't have to be on all these different meds and doing all of these different things. And so I really like it. I love what they're doing, and I just think, to me, it makes a lot of sense.
It does, absolutely. When you think about it, it made perfect sense to me. When I heard it, I'm like, of course, because, the body is a series of chemical reactions. Food is chemicals, all the stuff that we consume are all chemicals. And these are having an effect on the body. And, when you think about how destructive sugar is, and our bodies, don't play well with it, but we're consuming so much of it in the form of carbohydrates as well. I'm learning all this stuff at the moment. I've been down quite a rabbit hole, Dr. Josef, for the past 5 weeks or so on this. And I've now implemented in my life, the carnivore sort of lifestyle. I'm eating a lot more meat, and already seeing the effects that it has. I've completely cut out carbohydrates and fiber and fruits and all this. And I just eat now a simple, red meat diet. And it's absolutely fantastic. What it's done I never had any mental health issues per se, but I get those symptoms where you get days where you're feeling a bit down or your emotions are a bit, flustered or whatever. But 5 weeks into this, and it's all gone. It's all gone. My mind is so much more clearer and my moods are stable. And it just feels like I'm present and grounded in reality. And whenever I go out to the extremes, whether it's emotionally or whatever, or maybe I eat something which doesn't quite agree with me, my body now is able to come back to that center point a lot more quickly and a lot more calmly. That's what it feels like almost. And to say that, if anybody was to say, well, what's the scientific evidence about it? Well, I've looked at a few studies that have said, this is beneficial, but I don't think there needs to be a huge amount of scientific research into this. A lot of it is anecdotal, I get that, but so what if it is? If it's helping people come off, it's helping millions of people. If it's helping people come off their medications and improving their lives, so what? Let's do it. That's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, I think the people who complain about the evidence base are the ones that, have a stake in, the current model, because really, in many ways, these things are harmless interventions. I know sometimes getting onto keto can have some challenges and things like that, but if you were just doing a paleo diet, a careful one, which I think is also really good, that's pretty harmless. And, what the byproduct is going to be that you lose weight, and, you have more energy. They're harmless interventions. I talked to Georgia Eade recently, and she says that there's actually some quite involved clinical trials going on with placebo-controlled groups. So, they may have that research soon, on what these drugs are actually doing with mental illness. And isn't that crazy, right? That we've probably had about, tens of thousands of clinical trials on drugs, and we don't have one study, one good one on what diet is doing to mental health. It's just, it's numbers. Yeah.
It is interesting. And it does raise a number of questions, perhaps questions that we can go into another time, Dr. Josef. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and connect with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure, Reese. It's been fun. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. All right. Let's speak soon, Dr. Josef. Okay.
Okay.
All the best.